In this episode, Tom Fox and Stephen Martin look at the case of Dan Snyder in the NFL, the Alabama basketball imbroglio, and changes in Major League Baseball. I know you'll enjoy this episode of Sports and Compliance. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with my colleague Stephen Martin for another episode of Sports and Compliance. Welcome back, Stephen.
Thanks, Tom. Always great to be here with you.
So, Stephen, the world of sports continues to give us some great lessons around business ethics. And we can start with the all-time business ethics disaster of Daniel Snyder, owner of the team formerly known as the team who will not be named.
It might just not be a ethics issue as well as a compliance or legal issue as well, Tom.
Or legal, exactly, according to the state of Maryland. But today, I read that Dan Snyder, who has hinted that the Commodores are up for sale, has proposed to or demanded of the NFL that if he sells, they fully indemnify him personally for any claims against him. Now, this is 32 owners who, although they have allowed him to be an owner, probably haven't engaged in some of the conduct he's engaged in. So apparently he doesn't have too many friends left in the ownership base, and they're not very happy about this. Where can we start to unpack this?
Well, it's an interesting one where you get into, a question of somebody who may well have done some things wrong, which I think is relatively well established at the moment, is under current investigation, by the NFL for what are potentially serious kind of harassment, discrimination, other types of claims, including potentially a sexual assault that, he was involved in on his plane a number of years ago. So it's very interesting to see somebody in his position, try to suggest to the NFL that he should get the indemnity, right? For his own actions. And I'm not sure what that buys him at the end of the day, right? I mean, I don't know what the NFL could even indemnify him for, subject to him being kind of a private citizen at the end of the day. But, as we know, he's potentially going to sell his team. Some owners have suggested they might try to force him out. I think this latest claim on the indemnity, made it a little bit clearer for some of these owners that they do just want him out of the league at the end of the day. So I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, we don't know the background. I mean, maybe the NFL is threatening to sue him in a different way. But if he sells the company, the team, I'm not sure he needs the indemnity at the end of the day. But you see this a lot, where executives demand certain things, or they think that they should, because of their position, get enhanced benefits that other people wouldn't. You don't often see it when somebody causes their own problems and then asks to be indemnified for them. But we've seen that with CEOs before.
So I've done a lot of indemnity work over the years, and you generally cannot indemnify for intentional acts.
Yeah.
You generally can indemnify for criminal acts because there's almost always an intent requirement. And so if the NFL gave him an indemnity, they probably can't get insurance for that. Doesn't mean you can't give an indemnity. It just means you can't insure for it. Right. So you can't move that risk, which means it's the individual owner's money. So that would be yet another reason for this. But as you succinctly point out, most people don't ask for indemnities for their own actions from others. You mentioned investigation by Mary Jo White, former SEC commissioner. And this is an investigation commissioned by the NFL, being run by the NFL, as opposed to the first investigation, which was controlled by Snyder and the Commodores. No report was given. In the great Stephen Martin tradition, no written report was created. It was an oral report only. And so there's never been anything along those lines or information from that final report that's come out. And I think many people are waiting for the Mary Jo White report, one, because they have greater confidence in her personally, and two, the NFL's running it, and they've said publicly they'll release it. So I'm wondering if Snyder is going to try to use this indemnity to demand as a negotiating ploy to keep the Mary Jo White report from being publicly released.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. You and I talked about it a minute ago. I think it's certainly plausible that he's trying to do that. He's very upset that that report is going to be public, and that's probably the biggest open issue for him at the moment, although there are other government investigations that are ongoing as well in DC. But I think you're probably right as he wants to do that. I don't know how the indemnity at the end of the day and that request really pushes the NFL to say, okay, well then we won't make the report public, right? Because you know if you're the NFL and you say no, we're not going to indemnify you, what can Snyder then do next, right? I mean, he could refuse to sell the team, and then the owners would have to vote to remove him, and then you get into a big litigation battle, right? But he's already started that sales process. There's clear bids that are out there. There's interested parties, so it'd be hard to see what his damages really would be at the end of the day. He can say he's forced to sell, but that's a club that you have the luxury of being in as long as you're allowed and permitted to be in it. It's not a guaranteed right. So, it's going to be interesting to see how this standoff goes. I mean, he's super aggressive, and I think he's being super aggressive with the NFL. To what end is hard to tell on the indemnity.
That's a great question. To what end? Because he's already had bids. I believe the property, or the asset rather, was valued at 5.5 billion by his evaluation team, and he's already received bids above that amount that he is considering. One of which was from Jeff Bezos, former CEO of Amazon, owner of the Washington Post. The Washington Post has been very critical of Snyder, and Snyder, as appears, he will not engage with Bezos or Bezos' team around this. So at what point, I mean, when does the greater pig factor come in? I mean, how he bought this asset 30 years ago for under $500 million. He's going to sell it for 5.5 billion or above. I mean, at what point do you keep counting hundreds of millions of dollars as opposed to just washing your hands and say, be gone from
Yeah.
this turmoil?
I mean, this is a problem you and I don't have, Tom, right? Where some of those dollars might actually matter. When you're talking about 5 billion versus 5.5 billion, I guess the argument is who really cares at the end of the day. I mean, it is interesting because Dan Snyder, from the reports that are public, Bezos potentially had the highest bid out there, and maybe by a fair amount, like $500 million. I mean, who knows at the end of the day? But it sounded like he had the largest bid. And you would think economic rationality would play out here. And if you're going to sell the team, why not sell it to a bidder that could close the deal for sure? I mean, he certainly has the money to do it, and B, you're getting the top dollar. But because of the bad press that he got from his hometown paper, which we can all argue about press influence and whether Bezos influences editorial content at all, but he's basically like throwing a fit in his sandbox and taking his toys home. He won't sell it to Jeff Bezos simply because he wrote a bunch of articles about him that were negative. It seems a little ridiculous, but then again, everything you hear about Snyder is that's exactly his behavior and demeanor, and that's what got him into this situation to start with.
The one thing I can say with some certainty is we'll have the opportunity to discuss this further.
I'm sure we will.
Next up, there is a really tragic situation down at Alabama involving the University of Alabama, where a team member was embroiled in a shooting which killed a woman. And the team member is not charged in the case. He is not. His name is Brandon Miller. Miller is not alleged to be the shooter, but it is alleged that it was Miller's gun that killed the victim.
Mm-hmm.
And Miller is still on the team. He is still playing. There is a text message that surfaced in pretrial hearings where Miller texted another member of the Alabama basketball team, asked him to bring his car and his gun to the site where the victim was killed. So there's some murky facts here, but I guess what I really wanted to focus on, Stephen, is what the coach has done, the apparent tone deafness we have seen from the coach, and what should the university do? Now, Alabama has its best basketball team in probably 40 years. Brandon Miller is thought to be a first-round NBA pro prospect. There's talk Alabama may get a number 1 seed. So on the high performer scale, Brandon Miller meets your definition, I think.
Right.
So, how should the university think through this? We can leave the criminal procedure aside for others, but what should the university do? What should the university president do? How do they look at this from an educational institution perspective? Or is it just Alabama basketball?
It's honestly, this is a little shocking to me, but it's also, I guess, a classic example of a couple things we see in compliance. One is star performers. Sometimes there's just different rules for them, right? And that's just how it goes. And but it's terrible for your culture in the long run. It can be negatively impactful for sure, and other employees. But in this situation, we're talking about the law, we're talking about compliance, and we're really talking about ethics and what the right thing to do is here. The Alabama's coach was certainly trying to support one of his players. Another player who was a bench performer is the one that was involved in the shooting, has been arrested. One of his star players is the one, like you mentioned, Miller, who'd gotten the text to bring a gun in a car to this site of where this ultimate shooting resulted in a woman's death. And to me, it's been interesting to watch because the prosecutor said, we don't have any way to charge him for involvement in the crime. And to me, I'm not sure, I'm not up on Alabama criminal law, but it's pretty consistent with accessory before a crime or somebody who's involved in the commission of a felony. If you bring a gun that's not licensed to you and you bring it to another person who then hands it to somebody who shoots somebody dead, you're in the direct line there potentially of being criminally implicated. More important is that the basketball player Miller from Alabama, he made a decision, right? He knew this isn't a good situation. He knew there's a gun involved. He knew there's a dispute, and he showed up and gave it to his friend and teammate anyway. And to me, the fact that Alabama did not suspend him, right, regardless of whether he's ever going to be charged, but suspended him for the reputational damage that's done to the university and to the fact that he knowingly was involved potentially in criminal activity, whether he's charged or not, should have been an automatic suspension. The fact that they didn't do that and then tried to say, we're really supporting the athlete, we're working with him, he understands this is a serious situation, blah, 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 is all because they're number 2 in the country and the guy is a star. Right. And it's kind of shocking to me that Alabama has done it this way. But we're all used to big sports and, big performers getting away with things. And it seems to be in this case, that's exactly what happened. If I was the coach of the team, he would be sitting down, right? Because he made a bad decision that hurt the school, hurt the team, hurt the reputation of Alabama basketball, Alabama as an institution. And he needs to learn a lesson, right? I don't know when the last time is, Tom, that you walked up and gave a gun to somebody that was involved in the shooting, but I'm pretty sure you would know that that's a bad idea.
Even in Texas, where you don't have to have a license to do that.
Even in Texas.
Even in Texas. So the coach is a fellow named Nate Oates, and he has made several statements which perhaps most charitably could be termed as tone deaf around the situation. He just basically said his players were at the wrong place at the wrong time. Then he reached out to Ray Lewis. Now, Ray Lewis is a Hall of Fame linebacker without a lot of connections to Alabama, but he does have one connection. He was in a limo where people who were his friends murdered someone, and he testified against them one of the last times Baltimore was in the Super Bowl in the Super Bowl in New Orleans. So that raised a lot of eyebrows about reaching out to Ray Lewis for counseling in this situation. The his statements don't really seem to have put any comfort around the victim's family or focused on the victim in this. They are only supporting the player. And on one hand, that's what a coach should do, support his players. On the other hand, he's got a lot bigger issues, which you've identified correctly as the culture of the team. Right. Now, this is not Alabama football. This is not Nick Saban, but Nick Saban's the athletic director, I think. And certainly the university president's been involved in this decision. I don't mean to sound too cynical, but I would understand this a lot better if this was Alabama football. But it's only Alabama basketball. So, and then the last point I would raise in the area of perhaps the most tone deaf thing in all of this is in pre-game introductions, Brandon Miller has a little routine where he is patted down as if he's been arrested or patted down by police. And he did that at the first home game after the shooting. And he needs a whole new set of advisors.
Right.
That was
It is
just terrible.
it is shocking to see that he did that after, and that the coach said, "Well, I'm aware of it. We've talked about it. It won't happen again." Right? It shouldn't have happened ever to start with. It definitely shouldn't have happened after the shooting. The coach's statements, I mean, look, we've both been around athletics for a long time, right? Coaches support their players, but coaches also are teachers. They're also guides. They have a big impact on your life. There's life lessons here that are more important than the sport at the end of the day. And all you're showing everybody is, regardless of situation, it's game first. And, that's just kind of unconscionable to me. I mean, the fact that he would say, my players were at the wrong place at the wrong time, it's one thing to be involved in a shooting at, pick a box store or pick a park or something like that, where you're literally at the wrong place at the wrong time. And it's horrific. And we can debate that all day. It's another thing to bring the car and gun with you when you go to the wrong place at the wrong time. So it's not quite that simple.
The yes, absolutely. So for our next story, we wanted to take up the changes in the rules of Major League Baseball. And it involves really three areas. One is they've made the bases the size of a pizza box. Uh, number two is they put a clock in on pitch count, timer, and batter uh, staying in the box or getting in the box. And they've also outlawed shifts so that you have to have two players on each side of second base now. So baseball
And
is
on the infield, not in the
and
outfield. It's the
and
infield.
on the infield,
Right.
yes, and on the infield, Jose Altuve. Sorry, buddy. Uh, you don't have to throw from right field though anymore.
Yeah.
Um, Baseball probably has the least number of rule changes of the major sports, the most tradition bound. So anytime baseball changes something, it's a pretty big deal. Um, you and I grew up in an era. I grew up listening to baseball at night on the radio, and you could listen most games during the season. It was 2 hours. 2 hours and 30 minutes was a long game. So I could start a Astros game at 7, turn it off at 9, and meet my parents' bedtime deadline for me when I was growing up. And you can't do that anymore. So I'm pretty much all for anything that's going to speed up the game. Baseball's had shifts since Ted Williams played. In fact, the shift started to counteract Ted Williams. It was called the Boudreaux shift by the manager who implemented it. So we've had shifts forever. And if you can't hit it where they ain't, I don't have a lot of sympathy for you. The size of the bases, I'm pretty agnostic on that. I'm not quite sure how that's going to make things easier. It's like that you'll be at second base that much quicker. Maybe that makes a difference. I don't know. What are your thoughts on all this?
So it's interesting. I'll tackle the basis first, because I've not really paid attention as to why they did that, as opposed to just hearing that it's like pizza boxes, right? Which is what we hear. But I assume it's a little bit more of the ability, less injuries when you're coming into bags, some of those kinds of things versus speed up play. But we'll see. But I think that's one that people will adjust to, or they won't. But it'll be kind of non-existent in terms of changes. The shift is an interesting one, right? Because you're talking kind of classic baseball and the shifts, and they used to do it on occasion. But we've gotten now to the point where these shifts are so dramatic that you're filling half the field with all the players. The amazing part to me is it almost shows you how bad fundamentals are in baseball sometimes, right? Like most of these guys can't bunt anymore. Everybody used to be able to bunt, and now they can't go opposite field. So some of these sluggers, all they literally can do is pull the ball. And, how is that possible, right? Because you're right. You should be able to hit it through the open gap and shortstop and third base when nobody's standing there, or just lay down a bunt, right? And nobody's going to get you out. But they don't seem to have figured that out. I personally, over the last few years, have hated the shift. It just doesn't look like baseball to me because it's become so dramatic now and used so often that it's a little different than I think historically. I think it'll be a better game to see people in position and playing what I'll call really classic baseball. And so that one I do like. Look, the strike zone, I mean, the timer for the pitchers and the batters is going to be really interesting because you've started to see very odd things sort of happen here, right? There was a Red Sox game with, I don't remember who the other team was, but they called a third strike on the timer for the batter, and the game was called a tie because it was the last out of the ninth inning, right? And that was unusual. You've got people, there was a brushback pitch where a guy almost got hit by the pitch, bailed out of the box, and had to hustle back into the box to meet the second clock, even though he almost took one in the head. There's going to be a little tweaks here that go on, but I think it's dropped the game time from an average of 3 hours and 3 minutes or something to 2.5 hours, and that is better, right? Like, me, I'm a big Red Sox fan. I take my kids to Fenway, and they're good for like 5 or 6 innings, and then they're bored. So I think it helps speed up the game a little bit. They're certainly going to have to tweak it because we're getting some weird kind of outcomes in spring training, but I guess that's why they're testing it that way. You do get, there was a lot of stuff between pitchers and batters, and, some of it is gamesmanship, some of it is just slow play, right? Like the PGA Tour and just speeding some people up. So I think overall that'll be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I will say it used to drive me crazy to watch Big Poppy. And every, adjustment of
Yeah.
all of his batting gloves and all that.
And his
Uh,
arm stuff and elbow
yeah,
pad and shin guard.
I mean, I would just get in the box and start watching the pitcher and just try to time getting my bat up in the air about the time his arm is going back, so I would
Right.
have a chance to at least swing at it. Um, the I guess the thing from the compliance perspective is if these changes are as dramatic, at least in terms of the shift and the pitch count, uh, it reminds me that the rules always change. If you're a regulated industry, the SEC is always changing rules. They're tweaking rules. They're having rules put out for comment. They have rules that become effective. We just had a new one around insider trading that became effective, I think, last week. So the rules always change. And if you're in a multinational organization, you're going to be playing on a 5-dimensional chessboard. You have US law. You're going to have law of the country you're doing business in. You're probably going to have state law. You may have internal corporate law in the forms of policies and procedures. You may have other laws that you have to comply with as well. So that sort of nimbleness and agility is something that every CCO, I hope, understands that that's a part of the deal and something they have to be aware of. It maybe those changes in baseball will be dramatic, but the you know if you want to watch a World Series and it's not your home team and you're on the East Coast, you're making a hell of a commitment
Right.
because you're going to be up to one or two. And you and I both love baseball, and that's still a commitment if it's not our home team.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, the biggest knock on baseball is that it just takes too long, right? Games are too slow. And so, I think this is a positive step in terms of keeping people really interested in baseball. The younger generations that have a lot of different sports to play. Me, I played baseball in college, right? But my son barely played because he wanted to play lacrosse with his friends. And, so baseball certainly has some challenges in terms of what they're doing, coming up with the younger generations. So speed of the game is important. And I think that one's a good one. But you're right about the compliance connection, which is regardless of whether we like the rules or not, whatever the rules are you have to abide by them, right? And so that's kind of the issue. One of my kids just got in trouble at their school the other day because they left at lunchtime, and my daughter is a junior, so she's allowed to leave at lunch. But she took a friend of hers who's a sophomore who's not allowed to leave off campus and got caught, right? And now she's paying the penalty, which is not being able to leave campus for a few weeks and having to clean the kitchen area or the dining room area each lunch with her friend. And she's like, "This is unfair and this is outrageous and I can't believe this," and blah blah. And I'm like, "Zoe, you knew the rule, right? The rule was clear. You decided to violate it, and your friend knew it as well. and there are penalties to violating the rules, whether you think they're fair or not. If they're unfair, then you got to change them, but you can't just say, I'm being mistreated. So it's been kind of fun. We've had that conversation in our household the last few days about what's fair, and when rules are in place, what happens. And so these are all good things to understand, because there are consequences, whether positive or negative, to rules changes, and you kind of figure them out.
I think that's a great way for us to end this podcast, Stephen.
My daughter might not think so that I'm talking about her in a podcast, but I'm not sure she's watching me anyway. So,
All right. Until next time.
all right, Tom.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Sports and Compliance. I hope you'll join Stephen and I again for our next episode. Sports and Compliance is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.